Alright, what's up? So, I couldn't sleep. And I figured because, I don't need these on, because I have state, and we all have state tomorrow, I may as well be useful to some extent. So, here we are. And I'm going to be reading the art section. On the, this side, I'm going to have the art reproductions for reference as we're going through it. So, I mean, right now I can just be here. And then on this side, I'm going to have the text that I'm reading. I'm going to skip the introductions, but, and I'm going to skip art fundies, but I am going to do all of the selected works. So, yeah, art fundies is just, it's too much right now. Basically, a lot of stuff happened. Which, yeah, no shit, but whatever. Okay. So, colonial portraiture. Go ahead, scroll on down to Power View here. History of early American portraiture. In the British colonial period, when Puritans began to settle in New England in the early to mid 17th century, portraiture became a way for settlers to establish identity and record family lineages in a place that was far removed from the established social structure of England. Puritans explicitly rejected religious painting in their places of worship, as they associated it with excess and idolatry. However, portraiture could be used as a means of demonstrating piety. Puritans believed in the Calvinist doctrine of prosperity, which was the belief that God rewarded the hardworking and religious faithful with material wealth. While the Puritans disavowed ostentatious displays of prosperity, painting portraits allowed them to communicate the presence of God's blessing in subtle ways. Puritan painters favored the Elizabethan style of portraiture, as opposed to the grand banner style that came to dominate British portraiture in the 18th century. Inspired by court paintings of Anthony van Dyck, Elizabethan portraiture was linear and heavily focused on costume details. The pendant portraitures of John Freake and Elizabeth Freake and Baby Mary, painted around 1671 and 1674, exemplify this tradition. They were intended to demonstrate the religious devotion and wealth of the sitters. The artist is unknown, but he was likely an itinerant limner, a self-taught painter who moved from place to place, who would paint signage as well as formal portraits. The male sitter, John Freake, was a wealthy Boston merchant and lawyer. He is shown in a dark brown velvet coat decorated with 22-shilling shiny silver buttons. While the colors are sober, Freake's wealth is signaled by the rich materials on display, including the intricate lace collar, elaborate cuffs, and gloves. The dark, neutral background further focuses attention on the details of the dress and accessories. His wife, Elizabeth, wears a pearl necklace, a garnet bracelet, and gold ring, and her clothing is adored with ribbons and delicate lace. The lace would have been imported from Europe, the pearls from China, and the garnets from India. The paired paintings suggest not only the sitters' wealth, but also their involvement in global trade and rising consumerism in the 17th century. Another painting of this period similarly shows an interest in the world beyond the colonies. Thomas Smith's self-portrait from around 1680 pictures the artist in the foreground with the window in view of a seascape showing the Dutch and English ships. Smith was not a trained artist. He was likely a mariner involved in the international trade. His wealth is apparent from the fine ruffled lace adorning his neck. However, his hand rests upon a skull, a traditional memento mori, symbol in art. Memento mori is a Latin phrase meaning, remember that you will die. Its inclusion here suggests the early wealth and accomplishments are meaning in the face of the afterlife. The painting thus indicates Smith's wealth and social stature linked to his past as a sea captain, while also acknowledging the futility of material wealth in the face of mortality. By the 18th century, the spiritual question that preoccupied the Puritans had subsided, but portraiture remained an important tool for asserting identity and social status. Limners continued to provide portraits throughout the colonial era and early republic. Colonial folk portraiture is characterized by its flatness and linearity. In contrast, artists like John Smilbert introduced the modeling and naturalism to the colonies. Smilbert, who was born in Scotland and studied art in London, was the first academically trained artist to live and work in the colonies. His groundbreaking 1728 painting, The Bermuda Group, showed a complex arrangement of figures in different poses. Smilbert was an important figure in the next generation of American painters, including John Singleton Copley. Selected work: John Singleton Copley, Paul Revere, 1768. John Singleton Copley biography. Like Paul Revere, John Singleton Copley was born in Boston. Born in 1738, Copley was the only son of an Anglo-Irish couple, Richard and Mary Singleton Copley. His father died when he was young, and his mother married an English engraver and portraitist named Peter Pelham in 1748. Pelham provided his stepson with a crucial introduction to drawing, painting, and printmaking. Unfortunately, Pelham died just over 3 years after marrying Copley's mother. Copley took over Pelham's studio when he was only 13. He taught himself to paint using his stepfather's anatomy books and art prints as study guides. 3 years later, he also purchased the contents of John Smilbert's studio. Smilbert was a portraitist who had trained in Europe and owned a broad array of old master prints and engravings. While it became increasingly common for 18th century artists to travel to England for training, Copley was largely self-taught and did not go abroad until late in his career. Nevertheless, he became highly sought after in Boston for his lifelike, richly detailed portraits. He did, however, seek the approval of the British art establishment. In 1785, he painted a portrait of his younger half-brother, Henry Pelham, and sent the painting to the annual exhibit of the Society of Artists of Great Britain. Titled Boy with a Squirrel, the painting attracted the attention of Benjamin West, an American-born artist who had moved to London. The painting's realism highlighted Copley's ability to convincingly paint a range of textures and surfaces. West wrote to Copley and implored him to come to London to learn the European painting tradition. Copley would eventually take up West's offer, but not for 9 years. Until then, he continued to earn a good living by painting portraits of members of Boston and New York society. Just really quickly for reference, this is Boy with a Flying Squirrel. This is brought up on like every single art test. It was last year and it is again this year. So just keep in mind this painting right here, Boy with a Squirrel. It's John Singleton Copley's younger brother that he painted. He sent this to England, and Benjamin West really liked it. So just keep that in mind. This thing always gets brought up. So this is John Singleton Copley's first big painting. Keep that in mind. Anyways, okay. In 1769, Copley married Susanna Farnham Clark, the daughter of a wealthy merchant. The couple would eventually have 6 children together, and due to Copley's success as a portraitist and his wife's family money, they were able to purchase a property on Beacon Hill, the next door to John Hancock, one of the wealthiest men in Boston. In the 1770s, the 1770s were a turbulent time in the city. As tension with the British was increasing, Copley maintained friendships with both revolutionary and loyalist factions. His portrait of Paul Revere, who was a vocal member of the Sons of Liberty, was among the best-known works. But Copley's father-in-law, Richard Clark, was a loyalist whose cargo was tossed into the Boston harbor during the Boston Tea Party. As tensions in the city reached a fever pitch, Copley left the country for London in 1774. His entire family followed, and they never returned to America. Paul Revere, patriot, printer, silversmith. Paul Revere was born in Boston in 1734. His father was a French Huguenot named Apollo Riviere, who had anglicized his name to Revere in 1729. His mother, Deborah Hitchborn, was part of an established Boston family that owned a shipping wharf. Paul was the third of 12 children. His father was a silversmith, and Paul left school at 13 to become his apprentice. Working as a silversmith allowed Revere to interact with a broad range of Boston society, which provided useful when he later became politically active. Revere's father died in 1754, and after a brief stint in the army during the French and Indian War, Paul returned to Boston and took over the family silver shop. Really quickly, a Huguenot is a soldier for hire. Sorry, not soldier. It's a religion. It's a Protestant religion. So he was a French Huguenot. He's a specific sect of Protestantism. Anyways, discontent with British rule fermented in Boston as the local economy felt the effects of the Stamp Act of 1765. England had been financially devastated by the 7 Years' War, and taxing the colonies was an attempt to bring in more revenue. That same year, Revere joined a group of militants who called themselves the Sons of Liberty and formed an organized opposition to the taxation policies enacted upon its colonies by the British government. Revere not only engraved silverware and monograms and family crests, but he also began engraving metal plates and for printing and operating a small printing press in his workshop. After the Boston Massacre of 1770, Revere engraved a drawing by Henry Pelham, who was John Singleton Copley's half-brother, which was widely circulated. 3 years later, Revere was among the ringleaders of the Boston Tea Party, when colonists dumped tea from British merchant ships into the Boston harbor. Between 1773 and 1775, Revere served as a courier, delivering news of political unrest in Boston to New York and Philadelphia. Despite his activities, Revere is still better known in his lifetime as a silversmith than an activist. Records of Revere's silver commissions revealed that he sold practical items, including flatware, shoe buckles, and buttons. However, in the years that followed the Revolutionary War, he saw an increased demand for more intricately designed silver goods, such as elaborately decorated teapots and sugar bowls. Tea drinking, which had been curtailed during the Revolution in part due to the resistance to British taxes, returned in full force after the war ended. Prior to the war, it was common for colonists to acquire actual silver pieces, but after the war, it became popular to purchase large tea services. Beyond the Revolutionary War significance, Revere's teapots are a form of material culture that embodies the interconnected economy of the 18th century. They were formed from silver from Mexico, fashioned into pots in Boston, and brewed tea from Asia, which was sweetened with sugar processed from sugarcane harvested in the Caribbean by enslaved Africans. Today, example of Revere's silverwork can be found at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Revere was not widely known outside of Boston in his lifetime. His fame took hold more than 40 years after his death when Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem Paul Revere's Ride was published to wide acclaim in January of 1861. In the January 1861 issue of the Atlantic Monthly. The poem refers to an incident on April 18, 1775, when Revere was sent to warn John Hancock, Samuel Adams, and others that British soldiers were on their way to Lexington. However, the poem takes several liberties with the truth. Revere was accompanied by 2 other men not mentioned in the poem. It was one of them, Samuel Prescott, who completed the mission and alerted the residents of Concord of the approaching soldiers, while Revere was himself briefly detained by British forces. Subject matter and visual analysis. Copley knew Paul Revere for several years before Revere had become a devout patriot and member of the Sons of Liberty. Revere's reputation as a silversmith was well established, and he occasionally made the silver frames Copley used for his portrait miniatures. This portrait of Revere, wherein Copley paints Revere in his studio wearing work clothes, helping to distinguish an American painting tradition that was distinct from that of Europe. Revere is shown holding a silver teapot that he had crafted himself, and his fingernails are visibly dirty. His fingers are reflected on the surface of the teapot, which furthers the connection between his hand and the creation. The tool that he used to engrave the silver lie in front of him, and he appears to be acknowledging the viewer with a direct glance, while his chin rests upon his hand as if he is engaged in a thoughtful exchange. He is wigless and wears an unbuttoned vest with a simple cotton or linen shirt that is open at the neck, with no cravat or necktie, showing one of his hands holding a teapot and the other posed in the gesture of contemplation. The image of Revere suggests that he is capable of both physical labor and lofty thought. The informality of Revere's dress and inclusion of his work tools gives an immediacy to the painting. It feels as though we, the viewer, have interrupted him at his work. One of Copley's strengths as a painter was his ability to convey a range of different textures and surfaces. This skill is on full display here, from the gleaming sheen of the silver teapot to the reflective gloss of the wood tabletop, as well as the wrinkled cotton of Revere's work shirt. The reflections of Revere's shirt and tools can be seen in the polished teapot. This belies the naturalism of the scene, since it seems more likely that it is a rough workshop bench. The decision to have Revere holding a teapot was likely a deliberate one. In 1767, a year prior to the painting's commission, Britain enacted the Townshend Acts to raise money by taxing glass, paint, oil, lead, paper, and tea. As a silversmith, Paul Revere produced everything from spoons and buttons to tankards and teapots, or coffee pots. The deliberate inclusion of a teapot is a subtle nod towards the antipathy of the Townshend Acts and Revere's political affinities, as well as his involvement in the Sons of Liberty. Tensions over the Townshend Act would escalate in the years that followed, culminating in the Boston Tea Party in 1773, which Revere would help plan. Coincidentally, one of the ships involved was owned by Copley's father-in-law, loyalist to Richard Clark. Copley established his reputation by painting more traditional, formal aristocratic portraits. However, this painting is an anomaly in that it focuses on the nobility of work. It is a representation of an emerging nation that aspired to be non-hierarchical. Rather than valuing wealth and status, the portrait speaks instead to the nobility of work, thoughtfulness, and egalitarianism. It is necessary to note, however, that equality was very narrowly defined in the moment and limited to white landowning men. The painting reveals an early awareness that art could play a powerful role in creating heroic models for the new nation and for shaping democratic ideals. Portraits of Samuel Adams and John Hancock, two other noted patriots and Sons of Liberty, were publicly displayed in Franqueuil Hall in Boston. But the Revere portrait was unknown to the public until 1928, when it was first lent to the Museum of Fine Arts. Prior to that, it had been in the possession of Revere's descendants and relegated to an attic. The popularity of Longfellow's poem led to greater interest in the portrait. Selected work: Portrait of Phyllis Wheatley. Phyllis Wheatley, the subject of this portrait, was born in Gambia in West Africa around 1753. There, she was kidnapped by a slave trader and brought to Boston when she was a young child. She arrived in the city on July 11th of 1761 aboard a slave ship called Phyllis, which was the origin of Wheatley's first name. Her last name was assigned by the family who enslaved her. At the time, roughly 1,000 of Boston's 1,500 residents were enslaved people. Phyllis was sold by a slave dealer named John Avery to a merchant named John Wheatley and his wife Susanna. The intention was for her to work in the house for Susanna, but she was in fragile health from the transatlantic crossing when she arrived. Susanna Wheatley and her daughter Mary began to teach Phyllis to read Greek, Latin, and English. This was far from typical, and the majority of enslaved people were deprived education as part of their subjugation. The Wheatleys quickly realized that the young enslaved girl was a precarious student, rapidly absorbing lessons in history, geography, and literature. Wheatley's later writing revealed that she was familiar with the work of Alexander Pope, John Milton, Virgil, Ovid, and Homer. She was a gifted writer and published her first poem as a young teen in the Rhode Island Newport Mercury newspaper in 1767. She attracted considerable attention in 1770 when she published an elegant poem following the death of the Reverend George Whitefield. Whitefield was a prominent Anglican preacher who was one of the founders of Methodism. Based in Britain, he traveled through the colonies where his evangelizing sermons attracted large audiences. Wheatley's poem drew interest in both London and New England, especially among the growing evangelical community, as her poems started appearing regularly in newspapers. Susanna Wheatley sought help in publishing a book of Phyllis's work and located a sympathetic patron in Selina Hastings, seen to the right, who was a philanthropist and the Countess of Huntingdon. Hastings was involved in the Methodist movement, and the Reverend Whitefield had been the Countess's chaplain. She was deeply moved by the elegy. The Countess secured a publisher and printer in London to publish a book of Wheatley's poetry titled Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, when the poet was only 20. Phyllis Wheatley traveled to London in hopes of meeting her patrons and promoting the publication, but the Countess was ill, and the two were never able to meet. Nevertheless, Wheatley dedicated her book to Hastings. Abolitionists were vocal in England in the 18th century, and a 1772 legal judgment ruled that enslaved people could not be moved out of England against their will. Some sharp British critics noted the irony that American colonists were agitating for freedom while simultaneously keeping African Americans enslaved. One anonymous critic wrote of Wheatley, "We are much concerned to find that this ingenious young woman is yet a slave. The people of Boston boast themselves chiefly on the principles of liberty. One such act of the purchase of her freedom would, in our opinion, have done them more honor than hanging 1,000 trees with ribbons and emblems. The author, writing in December of 1773, was not aware that Phillis Wheatley had just been freed several months earlier. By the time she returned to London in the fall of 1773, Susanna Wheatley, who was ill and nearing the end of her life, arranged for Phillis's emancipation. She was a free woman when her book of poetry, published in London, arrived in New England in January of 1774. During the war, Phillis sent General Washington a poem written in his honor, and he wrote back asking that she visit him in Cambridge. She had previously met with Benjamin Franklin and Sir Brooke Watson, the subject of Copley's painting of Watson and the Shark, while in London. She commemorated the end of the Revolutionary War with a poem titled Liberty and Peace, a Poem. The war years that followed were personally difficult for Wheatley. Susanna Wheatley died in 1774, followed by John and Mary in 1778. The country had undergone an economic crisis in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War, as countless businesses failed, while bankruptcies and foreclosures were rampant. Phillis struggled to make a living, and despite her fame, she was not able to secure funding to publish a second volume of poetry. She married John Peters, a free black man, in 1778, but the marriage was strained and marked by financial troubles. The couple had 3 children, but none survive. Phillis Wheatley died at the age of 31 after giving birth to her 3rd child, who died the same day. They were buried together in an unmarked grave. Peters sold his wife's book and manuscripts to cover debts. Subject matter and visual appeal. The portrait appears as the frontispiece of Phillis's book of poetry. It was printed by Archibald Bell. However, the engraving was based upon a portrait, likely by an African-American artist, Sirpo Moorhead. This was a radical representation of an enslaved woman of the period in that she is depicted as an intellectual rather than as a servant. The poet is depicted in a moment of creative inspiration. She is shown in profile wearing a day dress with an apron, kerchief, and mob cap, and it is seated at an oval writing desk with a book, an inkwell, and a blank piece of paper. Wheatley holds a quill pen in her right hand, hovering just above a blank sheet, on the verge of bringing pen to paper. Her left hand extends upward to her chin in the classical thinker pose as she gazes upward into the distance, seemingly lost in thought. Her lips are pursed, suggesting a resolute concentration. There are similarities between her pose and that of Copley's portraiture of Dorothy Quincy from 1772. Both women rest their chin in their hands while they gaze off to the distance. Copley's portrait of prominent Bostonians were frequently exhibited throughout the city and would have been well known among Boston artists. Copley, however, did not show Dorothy Quincy or any woman in the act of writing. Portraiture of this period typically used attributes to define wealth and social identity of the sitter, and women were typically presented in passionate postures. Copley's painting emphasized Dorothy Quincy's costume, lavishing attention to her pink silk gown adorned with bows, lace cuffs, and frilly cap atop her head. She is surrounded by fashionable furniture. 3 years after the portrait was painted, Quincy married John Hancock, the first signer of the Declaration of Independence and the first governor of Massachusetts. The pose of Wheatley's portrait references one of the most prominent citizens in Boston. However, Wheatley is presented as an active rather than passive position. This image is groundbreaking in that Wheatley is defined as a writer and a thinker. The text that is inscribed in the border of the frame and printed portrait reads, Phillis Wheatley, Negro servant of John Wheatley of Boston. Here, servant is being used as a euphemism for an enslaved person tasked with domestic chores, while the blank page implies unlimited potential. The oval frame detailing her position circumscribes the subject within a limited sphere. Thus, while she dreams and writes of the world beyond her station, Phyllis Wheatley remains defined and confined by her circumstances. Serpio Moorhead and the question of the image's authorship. While the definitive attributes of Wheatley's portrait is unknown because it is unsigned, most scholars believe that Serpio Moorhead produced the artwork. Born around 1750, Moorhead was among the earliest known African American artists operating in the colonial era. It is believed that Moorhead was an enslaved person in the household of Reverend John Moorhead of Boston. He might have learned to draw and paint from Moorhead's wife Sarah, who was an art teacher. Moorhead's artistic services were advised in the Boston newsletter, where he was described as possessing an extraordinary genius. Wheatley and Moorhead were neighbors and knew each other in Boston, and Moorhead was commissioned to create a portrait of the poet. The original portrait was the basis for the engraving of an ink drawing. It has likely been drawn in Boston and sent to London to be engraved. The portrait was described in the British press as a fine likeness. Wheatley had dedicated a poem to Moorhead titled To S.M., a young African painter, on seeing his works, wherein she described the creative process as follows. To show the laboring bosom's deep intent, and thought in living characters to paint, when first thy pencil did those beauties give, and breathing figures learnt from thee to live. And how did those prospects give my soul delight, a new creation rushing on my sight? Still wondrous youth, each noble path pursue, on deathless glories fix thine ardent view. Still may the painter and poet's fire to aid thy pencil, and thy verse conspire. Wheatley's poem links painters and poets together, thus suggesting that artists and writers like Moorhead and herself could work together to enlighten the public. Unfortunately, none of Moorhead's original paintings are extant, but the portrait of Phyllis Wheatley that emphasizes her creative drive and intelligence is a testimony to Moorhead's ability. Selected work: Prudence Punderson, The First, Second, and Last Scene of Mortality. Embroidery and needlework as creative expression. While the majority of English of the 18th century American women were denied access to traditional fine arts training, most were taught handicrafts like sewing, weaving, and embroidery from a young age. As a result, samplers and needlework provided a creative outlet for this generation of women. While girls and boys were taught to read in most of the colonies, only boys were instructed to write. Girls were left to learn to form letters with an embroidery needle and by creating a sampler, which was a piece of needlework displaying various stitches, often containing the alphabet or embroidered verse. Young women from middle-class backgrounds and in urban centers such as Boston, Newport, and Philadelphia were sometimes sent in private academies where they would be taught needlework alongside music and watercolor painting. These schools would put on view their students' embroidery in annual exhibitions where awards were given for excellence. Before women were allowed to join fine art academies like the National Academy of Design, these annual needlework exhibitions were the only opportunity afforded to women to publicly display their creativity. The highly individualized samples were an outlet for women to express themselves, as one Maryland girl did when she embroidered hers with the sentiments, "Patty Polk did this, and she hated every stitch she did. She loves to read much more." Subject matter and visual analysis. The embroidered picture uses green, brown, black, gold, and cream thread on a silk ground, and measures just under 13 inches tall and under 7 inches wide. The composition depicts a well-appointed colonial room in Connecticut and includes a title signed in black ink on the bottom of the picture. the first, second, and last scene of mortality. The title reveals that this is not simply an embroidered scene of a woman in domestic interior. The artist, Prudence Prenderson, has created a continuous narrative showing 3 stages of an upper-middle-class white woman's life, moving from birth to middle age and ending with death, combined into a single self-portrait. On the right, we see her as a baby in the cradle being tended to by a black female servant or enslaved person. This inclusion reveals the importance of African American labor during the early colonial period. Above this woman in the picture is a picture within the picture. Punderson embroidered a frame painting herself showing a woman leaned against a wall with a male guard and soldier in medieval garb standing behind her. The center of the needlework shows Punderson as a fully grown woman working on an art project. She chose to depict herself as an artist at work, which fosters a visual connection to Phyllis Wheatley's portrait. Both works focus attention upon women seated at tea tables, wearing caps, and surrounded by tools as they prepare to create. The baby in the wooden cradle to the right, which represents the first stage of life, also can indicate that women in the center is the mother, and on the left is a coffin marked with the initials PP, alluding to the artist's name. There is a mirror on the wall above the coffin. It is covered, which was a common mourning practice. Using thread rather than paintbrush, Punderson succeeds in creating a continuous, complex narrative operating on multiple levels of meaning, all contained within a small needlework picture. This work also gives the viewer a window into what domestic interiors of the period looked like. The Pundersons were so well-to-do, as evidenced by the window treatments, gilt mirrors, Chippendale-style tea table, and geometric floor covering. The frank acknowledgement of the artist's own eventual death as part of the cycle of life is also reminiscent of Puritan portrait of John Thomas Smith with a skull. The subject matter, contemplating one's own mortality, is seemingly Morse, but death was a frequent occurrence in colonial America. The average life expectancy for a New Englander at birth was 42 years for women, and outbreaks of diseases such as smallpox, typhus, and yellow fever were more common in the colonies. Punderson herself would later die at an early age of 26, shortly after giving birth to her first child. The work might be the earliest self-portrait by an American woman artist. Contextual analysis. Prudence Punderson was born in Preston, Connecticut in 1758. She was the oldest of 8 children of the Ebenezer and Prudence Gear Punderson. She married Dr. Timothy Well Rossiter following the American Revolution. This needlework picture would have been sewn prior to her marriage in 1783. The couple had been courting since Prudence was 20, but they were driven apart during the war. Punderson's father was a loyalist, and the family's goods were confiscated in 1778. The family fled to Long Island to escape the rising tension and lived under receded circumstances for several years. During this time, Prudence took up domestic work to earn money. Rossiter, who was a patriot, stayed in Connecticut. After being apart for less than 5 years during the war, the young couple reunited and married. Unfortunately, Prudence would die less than a year later after giving birth to their daughter Sophia. In 2010, a contemporary artist, Kiki Smith, used this artwork as inspiration for an installation called Sojourn at the Brooklyn Museum of Art. The installation was a multi-layer, site-specific exploration of the cycles of a woman's life. Punderson's embroidery was linked to the exhibition, allowing visitors to make connection between the two artists. Patience Wright. Biography. This portrait depicts Patience Wright, who was a waxwork sculptor during the colonial period. Born Patience Lovell in 1725 in Bordentown, New Jersey, she grew up on a farm with Quaker parents. At 20, she moved to Philadelphia, where she married a cooper named Joseph Wright. The couple moved back to Bordentown Bordentown, where she raised a family for 20 years. After her husband died, Wright began sculpting to support her family. She and her sister Rachel Wells, went into business creating wax portraits. Although Wright and her sister were entirely self-taught, she had sculpted with modeling clay as a hobby since childhood. As her reputation grew, Wright moved to New York in order to reach a wider clientele. Wright began by modeling small portrait busts and cameos, and progressed to creating life-sized figures. Soon she became highly sought after for her portrait sculptures and her waxworks of notable figures like the famed evangelist Reverend Whitefield toured round the East Coast. The wax statues she created were fully dressed and featured details such as eyelashes, glass eyes, and realistic tinted skin tones. Wax sculptures were a popular medium, but not considered fine art, and such works were exhibited at fairs rather than salons or galleries. Wright's clients included the Lieutenant Governor of New York. Sadly, a fire ravaged through Wright's New York studio in 1771, destroying many of her artworks. After this setback, Wright decided to seek her fortune in London and moved there with her children in 1772. In London, she set up a waxwork display to advertise her skills and started receiving commissions from prominent figures in London society. She modeled a portrait bust of Benjamin Franklin, as well as one of the famed experiment artist Benjamin West. She sculpted King George, Queen Charlotte, and the Countess of Huntingdon. Unfortunately, few of Wright's wax sculptures remain. Wax is a delicate medium subject to breakage and damage from temperature changes. However, one of the artist's few surviving sculptures can be found in the collection of Westminster Abbey. It is a portrait statue of Sir William Pitt, Earl of Chatham. Pitt was known for his defense of colonial rights against the Stamp Act during the late 1760s, where he served as a prime minister from 1766 until 1768. Sculpted in 1769, Pitt is shown wearing a wig and his parliamentary robes. His right arm is extended, and he has a scroll in his hand. A 20th century cleaning of the sculpture revealed a great attention to detail. His hands are veined and even included tiny hairs. Pitt's facial expression conveys intelligence as well as compassion. Wright referred to Pitt as a guardian angel of America because he was vocal proponent of the colony. He was a vocal proponent of the colonies. Even though Patience Wright relocated to London, she remained an outspoken advocate for both American independence and the rights of women throughout her life. She criticized the policies of King George III, who nevertheless invited her to the palace for a portrait sitting. Her political allegiances were well known, and once the revolution broke out in America, she was excluded from royal circles. Despite this, she remained in London throughout the war. She would ship busts to her sister for display in New York and Philadelphia, and it was said that she passed notes with political information gleaned from her contacts with high-level British officials inside of the wax heads of her sculptures. She may have also passed information on to Benjamin Franklin in Paris. Wright was inspired by George Washington's leadership and wrote to him asking if he would sit for her. She had plans to embark upon a series of momentous honors honoring the heroes of the Revolutionary War. Washington replied that he would be honored to do so, but in 1786, Wright died before she was able to return to America to carry out the commissions. Subject matter and visual analysis. Robert Edgar Pine painted Patience Wright's portrait in 1782. Pine was a British portrait painter born in London in 1730. Pine was excluded from the group that founded the British Royal Academy of Art on account of his radical policies. Like Wright, he was sympathetic to the American quest for independence, and he painted Benjamin Franklin's portrait while Franklin was in London. Pine's career took the opposite trajectory of Wright, insofar as Wright had been born in Philadelphia and relocated to London, living there upon death, while Pine moved to Philadelphia in 1784 and lived there for the remainder of his life. Once in America, Pine went on to paint several notable citizens, including George Washington and his mother, Mary Ball Washington. Pine's paintings seem to allude to Wright's identity as an artist and her creative process. Wright is shown with an intense, upward gaze as though she is studying a sitter. Attention is given to her right hand, and her nimble fingers look active and ready to sculpt. In her lap, some gauzy fabric is a large lump of wax. This is an allusion to Wright's unusual working technique. She used the heat of her thighs to warm the wax and make it malleable. Contemporary accounts describe the technique. To keep the wax malleable, she molded the busts upon her apron, warming it with the heat of her body. At a certain point, she would pull the head out from under the apron and put finishing touches on it, under the astonishing gaze of the sitter. As described, the process almost gives the impression that Wright would give birth to her sculptures. An engraved print published in London magazines with the caption, "Miss Wright finishing a busto," depicts Wright with the sculpture busts that she appeared to be lifting directly out of her skirts, as if it emerged directly from her body. It was an unusual... What is it doing? It was unusual for women of this era to have a career with such a public profile, and Wright received a lot of attention for both her artwork and her outspoken political beliefs. The process of sculpting in wax. Waxwork sculpting is an additive sculptural process. Sculpture can be subtractive, which means that material is carved out or remodeled, as in marble or wood carving. Or it can be additive, meaning material is added and molded to create forms, as in clay or wax molding. Beeswax works well for shaping figures because it is somewhat pliable at room temperature and becomes increasingly malleable as the warmth of the artist's hands soften the material. Beeswax melts at low temperatures and can be easily tinted with mixes of pigments. Since wax is an organic material, it has been traditionally used to create effigies that bear an uncanny resemblance to human flesh. Some wax figures are made from direct impressions of faces or bodies, which further enhance their realistic appearance. Wax figures have been modeled throughout history, from ancient Egypt through the present, but they have not received significant art historical study. This is partially because the medium is extremely fragile, and many wax sculptures have been destroyed. It is also because waxwork displays of human figures, such as Madame Tussauds' worldwide chain of wax museums, are commonly associated with popular entertainment rather than fine art. Selected work: Gilbert Stuart, George Washington, Lansdowne portrait. Gilbert Stuart biography. Gilbert Stuart was born in Newport, Rhode Island in 1755. His father was a Scottish immigrant who found work in the manufacture of snuff. Stuart showed an early interest in painting and apprenticed with a local limner. He subsequently left America to study art in England in 1777. In the colonial period, it was common for American artists to travel to Europe for formal art training. While in Europe, Stuart met and studied with Benjamin West. It was hard to overstate the importance of West as a mentor, advisor, and instructor to the entire generation of American artists at the time, when the colonies were still struggling to assert themselves upon the international stage. West even provided financial assistance to some artists, including Stuart, who struggled with financial problems throughout his career. Stuart established his critical reputation when he exhibited The Skater at the Royal Academy in 1782. Its feathery, loose, impressionistic brushwork showed the influence of British portraitists, including Joshua Reynolds, Thomas Gainsborough, and John Romney. Grays and black dominate the composition and accentuate the pink of the man's skin. It was Stewart who suggested the sitter pose in ice skates because he thought it allowed the subject to appear active yet poised. The subject of this work led to numerous commissions. Unfortunately, the commissions could not keep pace with Stewart's extravagant lifestyles. 5 years later, he fled England for Ireland in order to escape his debtors. Stewart remained in Ireland for 5 more years before he once again racked up exorbitant debts, facing the prospect of debtor's prison. Stewart left Ireland and returned to America in 1793. He arrived in Philadelphia, which was then but the largest city and the nation's temporary capital. Stewart came home with a plan to secure a commission to paint the president's portrait, in the hopes that it would help him rebuild his career. Really quick for reference, this is the skater, so you can see he is wearing his ice skates, but still posed with his arms crossed, so that's what that's referencing. Presidential portraiture. In the period following the Revolutionary War, George Washington was elected and sworn in as President of the newly formed United States of America in 1789. Artists and craftsmen were then tasked with building a new image for the nation, which would help unify the regional factions and colonies under a singular national identity. A skeptical populace had to be persuaded to embrace the new categories of the nation and president. Between 1795 and 1825, Gilbert Stuart painted more than 100 portraits of Washington, helping to develop a unified iconography for the new republic. Stuart painted so many portraits of Washington that they have come to be distinguished by their alternate titles. His most recognizable painting is known as the Athenaeum portrait, because it was acquired by the Boston Athenaeum shortly after the artist's death. Today, it is jointly owned by the Museum of Fine Arts Boston and the Native Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. This image of George Washington has been reproduced more than any other because it was the source of the engraving of Washington that appeared in the dollar bill. Thus, more than any other image, it shapes our collective ideal of what the first president looked like. And then this is the Athenaeum painting, which was just referenced. If you notice, the face seen on Washington and the face seen here are very, very similar. And this is for reasons we're about to see. But just notice for now that the similarity between this face and this face here. There are very, very slight differences, but that is all. Originally commissioned by Martha Washington, the painting was left unfinished when Stuart realized he had created a successful likeness that he could use for a model for subsequent paintings. Oh, we're getting into it right now. Martha Washington pleaded for the portrait, but Stuart refused to give it to her. Leaving it unfinished allowed for the author to keep it in his studio indefinitely. Ultimately, Stuart copied the portrait more than 60 times and referenced to these works on his $100 bills, since that was the price he charged for them. He had no way of knowing that the portrait would one day circulate on the $1 bill, although the background of the portrait is neutral, with nothing to distract the viewer's attention. It also gives the painting a timeless quality. Washington was said to have a pale complexion, but Stuart portrays him here as pink-skinned and slightly ruddy. The painting emphasizes his aquiline nose and his sober, direct expression. His eyes look lively and active, while his pursed lips suggest discipline and self-control. Stuart's depiction of Washington emphasized the qualities the new, chaotic country needed, including moderation, restraint, resolve. It became so deeply etched in the population's mind that by 1823 a writer and critic remarked, "Though a better likeness of him were shown to us, we should reject it, for the only idea that we have of George Washington is associated with Stuart's Washington." So again, the reason that this Washington's face looks so similar to the Athenian portrait is because Stuart literally didn't finish that painting, so he could just copy the face over onto all of his other paintings of George Washington. So that's why this face is so similar. I just wanted to point that out. Subject matter and visual analysis. Stuart's 1796 full-length painting of Washington, which pictured in your art reproductions booklet and is known as the Lansdowne portrait, was originally commissioned by Senator William Bingham of Pennsylvania as a gift to the Marquis of Lansdowne. The original is now owned by the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. 3 copies of the Lansdowne portrait were made, one of which was hung in the East Room of the White House since 1800. The painting was famously rescued from the burning of Washington in the War of 1812 by Dolly Madison and Paul Jennings, an enslaved man who was James Madison's personal servant. This portrait is a clear depiction of Washington as a leader. Stuart used the Athenian portrait as a model for painting the head, but drew upon other sources for the body and pose. See again. Here, Washington stands with an upraised arm, signaling that he intends to make a public address. It may be a reference to an address he delivered to Congress in December of 1795. He could also be bidding the nation farewell. This was painted not long before Washington's farewell address to the nation was published. Or he could be gesturing towards the nation's future. Stuart likely based the pose on a 1720 engraving by Pierre Drevet of Bishop Jacques Benin Bossuet. After work by Rigaud, even the background is the same. The upright posture with an extended arm was also common in ancient Roman statues of Republican senators. This is clearly a picture of Washington the ruler, not Washington the general. He is situated in an office as opposed to a battlefield. The books atop his table on the floor include a copy of the Constitution, volumes of the Federalist, and the Journals of Congress, underscoring the president's studious commitment to leading the country. The quill pen and inkwell might refer to Washington's signing bills into law. Symbols of the new nation are scattered around the room. We see an emblem of the 13 stars and stripes in the medallion on the back of the chair. There are bald eagles carved in the legs of the desk. Upon closer examination, the eagles clutch bundles of arrows. We were indicating their readiness for war. Eagles and arrows were also symbols of the Iroquois Confederacy and organizing bodies of the Six Nations. The inclusion of this iconography suggests the ways in which the Continental Congress appropriated the political structure of the Six Nations when they unified the 13 colonies. The table leg is carved to resemble faces, the bound bundles of rods meant to symbolize power in ancient Rome. This classical column in the background further ties the emerging nation to Greek democratic ideals. The combination of a column and drapery in the backdrop were common in medieval and European grand manner portraits of nobility. This can be seen in Hythensia's Rigaud's 1701 portrait of Louis XIV and Anthony van Dyck's 1636 portrait of Charles I. At the same time, Stuart makes clear that Washington is democratically elected leader and not a royal figure. With his sober, understated demeanor and simple dark clothing, rather than the robes of a monarch, he wears a black suit of a citizen leader. The sheathed sword at his side is a ceremonial reminder that as president, Washington was also head of the military. In the sky in the background, you can see dark clouds dissipating and a rainbow emerging. While the new republic had weathered turbulent times, the rainbow suggests the presence of continual hope for the future. And I will go into this in a later recording, hopefully if I get to it. But note the similarities and connections of Greek and Roman iconography. If you haven't already This is common, especially in depictions of Washington. We'll see later with the statue of Washington. The lack of a cultural unity in America gave rise to a emphasis on Greek and Roman culture that had come before it. And in the literature section, all the comparisons of America to the Greek and the Romans can also be seen as this connection. So yeah, it's just something to note. Again, it is very late at night and I am tired, but I'm going to try and continue. I'm going to go ahead and upload just section 2 by itself in case I don't get through section 3 and or section 4. But yeah, thanks for listening. I hope this hour was helpful.